Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's installment in the Understanding HUD Environmental Reviews webinar series, sponsored by HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, or CPD. My name is Mark Allison. I work for the Center for Social Innovation, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of CPD and the Office of Environment and Energy, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. Today's webinar is Protecting Our Natural Resources, Complying with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the Farmlands Protection Policy Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Before we begin, I would like to make some logistical announcements. Today's webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, and the webinar is being recorded. You can access a PDF of the slides in handout format through the link on the file sharing box entitled Natural Resources Handout in case you want to follow along by taking notes next to the slides. The recording and the PowerPoint presentation in full slide format with notes included will be posted on HUD's CPD environment page, the link for which you'll find in the Q&A box. You can check the training website for updates to this webinar series, including the full recording of today's webinar and other webinars, and for in-person training opportunities. The full series should be available online by October. As an attendee of this webinar, your microphone will be automatically muted. Please listen to the presentation through your phone for best results. The call-in information has been sent to you, and it is also listed in your meeting room screen under audio instructions. Another option is to use your computer speakers. This means that you'll need to turn on and turn up the speakers on your computer. Due to the large number of attendees, there may be a slight delay in the advancement of the slides. Whenever possible, always use a landline connection, not wireless. Also, please run as few other programs on your computer as possible during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know by using the question and answer box on your screen. You may also submit content-related questions using that same box. Feel free to submit questions at any point during the webinar. Immediately following the webinar, you will be directed to a follow-up survey. Participants are strongly encouraged to respond to the evaluation to improve future webinars. During the webinar, we will be asking poll questions, one of which you will see on your screen now. Please take a moment to answer this question, as well as the others we will ask throughout the webinar. Today's webinar will feature 3 different acts under the umbrella of natural resources protection: the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, presented by Sarah Jensen, the Farmlands Protection Policy Act, presented by Deborah Peebler-Stewart and Chris Hoffer, and the Endangered Species Act, presented by Liz Cepeda. There will be a short amount of time for questions following the Wild and Scenic Rivers and Farmlands Protection segments, followed by a longer opportunity for questions on all 3 acts after the Endangered Species Act. Sarah Jensen and Deborah Peebler-Stewart are HUD environmental officers in Region 10. They cover Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. These states have many natural resources, and Debbie and Sarah strive to provide specific guidance to help responsible entities in their region to comply with their environmental responsibilities. Chris Hoffer, on temporary assignment, is a Presidential Management Fellow and works on the Department's Sustainable Housing and Sustainable Communities initiatives. Liz Cepeda is an environmental specialist based out of Washington, D.C. Liz came to HUD 2 years ago as a Presidential Management Fellow and, among other things, serves as HUD headquarters expert for the Endangered Species Act. This webinar is designed to address 3 learning objectives. First, the presenters will provide overview of the 3 acts. We hope that today's webinar will provide participants with a greater understanding of the requirements that must be completed for all HUD projects to comply with these acts. And finally, participants should come away with knowledge of where they can go for further resources and to answer questions that may come up after the webinar. And with that, I'd like to pass this over to Sarah to begin today's presentation. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. I will start us out today with a discussion of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. This law was enacted in 1968 after a decade of growing concern with a number of rivers being dammed for hydroelectric power. The act was designed to protect the free-flowing characteristics of designated rivers. It initially designated 8 rivers and set up mechanisms to add more. Today, there are 203 rivers designated in 38 states and Puerto Rico. This is less than 1/4% of the nation's rivers. By comparison, there are more than 75,000 large dams across the country that have modified at least 600,000 miles of river. I see some of you have answered the poll question, and a lot of you are guessing that that's 25%. In fact, that's 17% of American rivers, which is still a pretty significant amount. Thank you for answering the poll question. Rivers can be added to the list by Congress or through the Secretary of the Interior. To qualify for designation, a river segment must be in free-flowing condition and have one or more outstandingly remarkable values, such as scenic, recreational, fish and wildlife, historic, or cultural. The majority of listed rivers flow across federally owned lands. Therefore, the likelihood of an intersection with HUD projects is low. However, if this issue comes up on a project you're working on, we want you to have the tools to comply. Okay. Once a river is designated as wild and scenic, rivers are then classified into one of 3 categories. You can see here, they are either wild, scenic, or recreational. The main differences in classification are how accessible the rivers are by road and how developed they are, with wild rivers being the least accessible and developed, and recreational rivers the most. The Act includes 3 components of river protection. One is management, and this is under Section 10 of the Act. Each river is administered by either a federal or state managing agency with the goal of protecting and enhancing the values that caused it to be designated. It's important to note that the designation neither prohibits development nor gives the federal government control over private property. You may intersect with this management portion of the Act through land planning or permitting. Another component of the Act is water rights. Normally a state right, the Act reserves federal water rights for the managing agency to retain enough water to protect the designated river, and this is under Section 13 of the Act. The true teeth of protection under the Act is Section 7, the protection from federal activities. This is where the Act applies directly to your HUD projects, and this is what we will talk about today. Let's walk through the compliance steps for your environmental review under Section 7. The first step is to determine if your project is near a wild and scenic river. Please note on this slide there are 2 categories of rivers you must consider, those that are designated and those that are study rivers. Study rivers are rivers under formal consideration to be designated and are given the full protection of the Act during the study period. Your source for determining whether your project is near a listed river is this website, rivers.gov. Here's a screenshot of this website. When you go to rivers.gov, you'll see a number of tabs across the top with many resources for you, including maps, statutes, regulations, and guidance documents. There's also a really helpful contact person that you can reach at this tab, Contact Us. And at the kids site, there's actually some nice summary documents. There's a list of all the states that have wild and scenic rivers. Under the National Systems tab, which is over here, there is a link to designated rivers, designated wild and scenic rivers. And when you click on that, you'll come up with this nice map. And when you roll over the state of interest, it'll come up with the name, and you can click on that for the list of rivers. I've picked Washington since I'm located in Seattle. There are 3 designated wild and scenic rivers in Washington. Before we move on, is there a poll question up? Or could we get our poll question? We'll get that up and come back to it. There are 3 designated wild and scenic rivers in Washington. And I clicked on one of the three, which is the Skagit River. And you can see here that there's information about that river. The first thing I want you to note is the agency at the top, the managing agency. In this case, it's the U.S. Forest Service, the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. That would be who you would contact if you had any questions or needed to consult regarding your project. The next thing I want you to note is that there are a designation for, the designation is for a particular reach of the river, not the entire river. You can see here a legal description of the boundaries of the reach, and you can also click on the map where this magnifying glass is, and you can see a graphical description. The map is not very detailed, so if your project is near the river, you should contact the managing agency for a more detailed map. One thing to note, however, is that the restrictions apply upstream, downstream, and on tributaries to listed rivers. I will talk about this more later, but for now note that you have to look beyond just the boundaries of the reach.
And Sarah, this is Mark. We had the poll question up on the last slide, and it looked like most people chose Alaska.
Okay, is there any way to get that back up, or is it gone?
Let us try to check into that here.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Here's the poll question. So it looks like a lot of you guessed Alaska, 67%, and the second one is Oregon and then Minnesota. Okay, in fact, Oregon has the greatest number of listed rivers at 57. Alaska was a good guess. There are 25 rivers in Alaska. There are only 2 designated rivers in Minnesota and only 1 designated river in Maine. Thanks for participating in that. Once you've checked, so I've mentioned that there are 3 listed rivers in Washington. Once you've checked that, remember that you are not yet done. You need to also check for any study rivers near your project. Again, under the National System tab at the top, you will find a list of study rivers. As of today, the study rivers on this list have all either become wild and scenic or been dropped. However, you should check to make sure none have been added. After completing this first step, many of you will find that there are no designated wild and scenic rivers or study rivers near your project. In this case, you can make a determination that your project will have no impact on wild and scenic rivers, and you would print out the map or list of rivers from this website, making sure to check for study rivers, and put this in your environmental review record. Many of you may additionally find that there are no designated or study rivers near the geographic boundaries of your jurisdiction. For example, those of you in Maine, there's only 1 listed river, and it may not be anywhere near where you do your projects. In this case, you could print out a map or list for documentation, place this in your central environmental file, and refer back to it as you do your environmental reviews throughout the year. These lists are not static, and new rivers do get listed, so you should check every year to see if any new rivers have been designated or listed as a study river. And in the course of researching for this presentation, I learned that there is currently a bill in Congress to designate 19 new rivers on the Olympic Peninsula. So those of you in Washington State should keep an eye out for that. If you determine that your project is near a wild and scenic or study river, step 2 is to determine if it is a water resources project. You can see the definition here on this slide. You are using HUD funds, so your project will meet the first half of this definition. Then you need to determine if your project could affect the free-flowing condition of a wild and scenic river. The slide lists some examples, but please note that these are not inclusive. If your project is not a water resources project, you would make a determination in your environmental review record. Your documentation would be a description of your project and a discussion of how this does not meet the definition of a water resources project. If your project does meet the definition of a water resources project, for example, you are funding a road or a project that needs a 404 permit from the Army Corps, then you would move on to step 3. Sorry about that. Step 3 is to make one of the following determinations. You need to determine whether the water resources project will have a direct and adverse effect within a wild and scenic river boundary, or whether the water resource project will invade the area or unreasonably diminish the river outside a wild and scenic river boundary. I've been saying throughout this presentation you need to check if you are near a wild and scenic river, but have not defined near. Here you see that you need to consider your impact both within and outside the designated boundaries of the listed river. Here's a graphic representation of the Section 7 process that gives some more detail about how to make this determination under Step 3. This flowchart is for projects within the boundaries of a wild and scenic river. I've adapted this from a Wild and Scenic River Act guidance document, and there's a copy of the original flowchart in the attachments to this presentation if you would like to refer to it later. You can see on the left there's a strict prohibition on projects listed by the licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. On the right side of the checklist is the Section 7 process for other federal agencies, including HUD. The detail I want to point out here is that Section 7 only applies to water resources projects within the river bed or river banks of a listed river. I can move the arrow. So it's, I'll just point that out and you can read this in more detail later. If you are outside of the bed or bank of the river, there is no need for the Section 7 evaluation process. If the project is within the bed and banks, you would work with the river managing agency to evaluate the project using the direct and adverse effect evaluation standard. This next slide shows the process if you are outside the boundary of a wild and scenic river. That doesn't mean anywhere in the state. Outside the boundaries means you are either upstream of the designated reach, downstream of the designated reach, or on a tributary to that designated reach. This process, I want you to note, also only applies to projects in the bed or banks of those upstream, downstream, or tributaries to the wild and scenic river. Again, if your project is in the bed or banks, you would work with the river managing agency to evaluate the project using the standard invade the area or unreasonably diminish the river. An example might be if your HUD funds are going into building a low bridge above the designated reach of a wild and scenic river. That project could affect the free-flowing condition of the river, and you may need to go through the evaluation process. Another example might be building a road across the river below a designated reach. This could impact the ability of fish and wildlife to reach the designated stretch of river, and you may need to go through the evaluation process for that project as well. Here's another example. This is pulled directly from the Wild and Scenic River question and answer document. The scenario is that a small community proposes to withdraw water from a designated river for domestic purposes. The response is that Section 7 would apply if the project requires construction within the bed or banks of the designated river. So if the town had to install pumps and pipes to get the water, Section 7 would apply. If the system is already in place and they are simply drawing more water, Section 7 would not apply. The answer does note that the river administering agency could invoke its water rights under Section 13, and that may come up through your permitting in your project. Another example from the same question and answer states that rehab of existing facilities does not normally require Section 7 consultation. If you determine that there is no need for Section 7 consultation because your project is not within the bed or banks of the river, you would write this determination in your environmental review and attach documentation showing how you reached this decision. HUD recommends that you work with the river managing agency on this determination. The final step is if you determine that there is a need for Section 7 consultation, you would go ahead and consult with the river managing agency. Here on this slide is a link to the evaluation procedures you would follow. There's one set of procedures for projects within the boundaries of the river and a second set if you are outside the river boundaries. The type of information you will need to provide includes information about the proposed activity, a description of how the activity will impact the river channel, the riparian or floodplain conditions, or upland and downstream conditions. The river managing agency may ask for additional information as well. Potential outcomes from the evaluation include determination of no effect. The river managing agency may require some mitigation, or there may be an outright prohibition of your project. If your environmental review should include a determination of effect and a copy of all evaluation process documents. If there is any mitigation, make sure to include this in your environmental review and also in any project contracts to ensure that the mitigation is followed. You should also make sure to monitor to make sure the mitigation is followed. You are now finished with Section 7, but you are not quite finished with the Act. There is another list of rivers to consider. The Nationwide Rivers Inventory is a list of rivers that are eligible for wild and scenic designation. Federal and state agencies can put these rivers on the list. Rivers on this list do not have the protections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. However, Section 5D of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, as well as a subsequent executive order, directs federal agencies to avoid or mitigate adverse effects to these rivers. Your compliance steps are very similar. The first step is to determine if there are any listed rivers near your project. On this slide is a link to the list of rivers. There are many more rivers on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory than are designated as wild and scenic rivers. We saw earlier that Washington has 3 designated rivers, but it has over 200 rivers on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. Many of these rivers flow over federal lands and won't have much intersection with HUD projects, but some do not. If you find your project is near a river on this list, the next step is to determine if the proposed water resource project will have an adverse effect on the natural, cultural, and recreational values of the segment. Note that again, that your consideration is limited to a water resource project. If you determine that there may be an adverse effect, your final step is to determine whether your project will foreclose the ability to classify the segment as a wild and scenic river at some future date. You, as the federal agency or responsible entity, make the determinations, the second and third determinations. But the National Park Service is there to assist you, and you can find a contact for each state at the Nationwide Rivers Inventory website. This concludes my discussion about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and I would now be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll take a few minutes for some questions. You can use the Q&A box to type in your questions. If we don't have time to answer all of them now, we'll go back to those later after the other presentations. But we do have some questions that have come in. So the first question is, how could this law impact my housing development near a wild and scenic river?
That's a good question. The first thing you would want to check is whether your project meets the definition of a water resources project. So if your housing project would be filling in a wetland and needing a 404 permit, you would meet that definition. If your project is doing any infrastructure work that could meet the definition of a water resources project, you would want to move forward with the further compliance steps. The next step would be to see if your work is in the bed or the bank. So the example that I gave might apply. If you needed to pull water from the river in order to have water come to your housing project, that may be a point where you would intersect with Section 7 and have to go through the evaluation process. And if you ever have a question, if you are doing a project near a wild and scenic river, you should contact the managing agency and they would be happy to talk with you and tell you, no, that won't have an impact, or yes, that does need to go through the consultation process.
Thank you, Sarah. The next question is, what about my private property rights if I am near a listed river?
That's another good question, and that's something that the Act is very clear in the language of the Act itself. that being designated as a wild and scenic river does not impact private property rights, and it does not halt development. Development is still allowed. The only thing that is prohibited is building dams, and then also anything that could have a direct impact in the bed or the banks of the river with federal funds.
And we have another question. How far up and downstream of the reach do the rules apply?
That's a good question. There is no definition of how far up or downstream the rules apply. If you are up or downstream from a designated reach, you would want to look carefully at your project and whether it could have an impact on that reach. And that is, again, a place where you would want to contact the river managing agency for further guidance.
We have another question. What is the definition of near a river?
Definition, I used the term near, but I didn't really define it. Basically, you want to see whether you are within the designated reach of the river or whether you're working on a tributary or in the river above or below the reach, upstream or downstream. So near, there's really no definition of the cutoff of what is near. But again, the Act only applies to if you're doing a water resources project, and then further if you're working in the bed or the banks of the river.
Next question is, what is the executive order number?
The executive order number, I will have to get back to you with that number. And we are going to post questions and answers, and I will be sure to put that number.
And the next question is, if a project is in the bed or bank, then wouldn't it also likely be in the floodway and thus otherwise be ineligible for HUD assistance?
Thank you. That is a very good question. That is true. If you're working in the bed or the bank, that often is in the floodway. There are some exemptions for projects, for example, a bridge or a road that are functionally dependent uses. Those can be done in the floodway. But you're right, there's a very limited number of HUD projects that would intersect with this act.
And one more question. If only a portion of the river is designated as wild and scenic, must you only consider that section?
You would consider that section when you're doing the evaluation of a direct adverse impact. However, the upstream portion, tributaries to the river, and downstream portion, you would need to consider whether, and let me get that slide so I can get the language correct. The evaluation standard is whether your project could invade the area or unreasonably diminish the designated wild and scenic river. So if you're doing something like the examples I gave where you could be impacting the flow to the river with something you're doing upstream, maybe you're pulling a lot of water out, that would be something you would need to consider. Or if your project downstream could impede the progress of fish or recreation users of that river, then you would need to consider that.
And we have one last question for now, which is there a 200-foot boundary from bank or bed?
I will have to get back to you with an answer on that. There is a legal description of what the bed or bank entails. There's also a further designation. Wild and scenic rivers can be, there's an area that's designated on either side of the river. It goes out in Alaska a half mile, and it goes out in the lower 48 a quarter mile on either side, but that has more to do with the managing agency and their work, and it doesn't have as much to do with Section 7. But I will get back to you on the question and answer.
Thanks, Sarah. We do have a couple more questions, but we'll be moving on to the next presentation, and we'll get back to those questions and others you might have on wild and scenic rivers after the other two presentations. So next we'll be moving on to Debbie Peebler-Stewart, who will be talking about the Farmland Protection Policy Act.
Thanks. Similar to the Wild and Scenic River Act, you may not have to comply with the Farmland Protection Policy Act often, but when you do, you need to know what to do. When you think of farmland, I bet you think of food. We all know about the importance of farmland in providing food for our communities. However, some of the things that we don't often think of in relation to farmland is the environmental importance in providing habitat for wildlife, flood control and protection, maintenance of air quality, and protection of watersheds. Farmland is also an important part of our scenic and cultural landscape. It's what makes many communities special, and in many areas is important for tourism. Productive agricultural land is a finite and irreplaceable natural resource. Fertile soils are the result of climate, geology, and biology, and take thousands of years to develop. While it is irreplaceable and finite, agricultural land is also often flat, well-drained, and affordable, perfect for building. In the 1980s, the National Agricultural Land Study found that millions of acres of farmland were being converted to non-agricultural use in the United States each year. It was determined that much of the conversion was due to projects that received federal funding. In 1981, Congress passed the Agricultural and Food Act that contained the Farmland Protection Policy Act. The final rules and regulations were published in the Federal Register in 1985. HUD actually came out with instructions to grantees within a year of the rule. Let's look at the poll question. Okay. Actually, most of you are wrong. The American Farmland Trust reports that an acre of farmland is lost to development every minute. That's based on the National Resource Inventory. It's a survey of the nation's non-federal farmland. The survey was conducted between 1982 and 2007 and found that 23 million acres of agricultural land was lost to development. 38% of the lost agricultural land was prime. Farms closest to our cities produce much of our fresh fruit, 91% of fruit and 78% of vegetables. These farms are directly in the path of development. Let's go back to the Farmland Protection Policy Act. The purpose of the Act is broad. It requires federal agencies to consider the impact of their programs on farmland before approving any activity that would convert farmland to non-agricultural use. It requires that federal programs be compatible with state, local, and private efforts to protect farmland. Since most of you represent entities that have taken on the role of federal agency as a responsible entity, you're responsible for complying with the Act. I'm going to go through the process that you'll need to follow, or hopefully are following. The first thing you need to do is determine if the type of project you're reviewing is exempt from compliance with the Act. The first 4 exemptions can be determined based on the nature of your project. If your project consists of providing funds for rehab on an existing building, you can make a determination that you're not converting farmland to non-agricultural use. The same goes for construction of minor secondary structures, such as a garage or storage shed. If the project consists of on-farm building or facilities required to run an efficient farm operation, let's say like a shop to hold machinery or a silo for holding crops, the project is exempt. Usually, HUD funds aren't used for these types of projects or for water storage, such as a water tower or reservoir. But if they are, they're exempt from the Act. The final exemption on the list requires that you look at information other than the project description. There are several ways to determine if the project is already on or committed to urban development. I want to stress that one of these ways is not through zoning. There are 3 different maps that can be used to identify if a project area is committed to urban area. They're the U.S. Census Bureau map, the United States Geological Survey topographical maps, and the United States Department of Agricultural Important Farmland map. As I said before, determining if a project is zoned non-agricultural is not a method to determine if it is committed to urban development. Considering land density is a method that I'll discuss in a couple of minutes. Chris, can you give a quick demonstration to show how you can determine if your project is in an urban area based on the census area map?
Sure. So to use an online tool to look at the census data, you can go to tigerweb.geo.census.gov or just search for U.S. Census TigerWeb. You'll start with a map of the U.S. and a map content menu where you can choose which types of data layers to view. You'll want to select urban areas as a layer and choose any other helpful layers such as transportation or census tract to help identify your project site. Once you've selected your layers, you can close or minimize the window, and you can access this map content window at any time by going up to the top of the screen. Once you've selected your layers, you click on the pan icon in the upper right and use the zoom in and zoom out tools to find your project site. Note that you can't actually enter an address. You have to pan and zoom to find your location, and there is some time as it loads as you zoom in and out. Eventually, you'll have zoomed into a map of your project site. Here, I have the Portland urban area in blue and some of the nearby urban clusters in purple. An urbanized area is a census-designated area with at least 50,000 people, and an urban cluster has less than 50,000 but more than 2,500. Both typically have densities greater than 1,000 people per square mile, and both are exempt from the Farmland Protection Policy Act. Once you've brought up your map, you'll need to use a screen capture of the map, such as using print screen. Be sure to add your project location to the map and also include the date when you access TigerWeb to file and include this information in your environmental review record. And there's a legend at the top of the screen to help clarify what you're looking at on the map, as well as a help button, which includes an instructional video that explores more advanced features. And that's it for the TigerWeb tool. We've prepared a simple handout with these instructions for future reference. Debbie, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, previously I glossed over the determination that a project was already committed to urban development based on land density. The determination relates to land where there are at least 30 structures on a 40-acre site. There are rules concerning figuring out the land density. I suggest contacting the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and that's an agency within USDA to help you with the determination. For some of you who have been around for a while, the NRCS used to be called the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. The contact information is found at the resource slide at the end of the presentation. Generally, there is a contact in each county in each state, and they're going to be your main source of information as you go through compliance with the Farmland Protection Policy Act. I asked the national contact about the land density exemption and discussed a situation similar to the one identified in the slide. The yellow box is proposed as an infill lot. I was told that it was possible to exempt it based on the land use density exemption because it was surrounded by houses and could not reasonably be used as farmland. It also has more than 30 structures on a 40-acre site. The blue lot would not be exempted. So again, if you want to use this exemption, I suggest contacting your local NRCS representative. If your project meets any of the exemptions that I've described, you can make a determination that your project does not convert agricultural land to non-agricultural land, and the Farmland Protection Policy Act is not triggered. If the total area where your entity provides HUD funds is designated as an urban area on one of the maps previously discussed, you can make a determination for all projects that fall within the urban area. Be careful to reconsider if new land is annexed into your area of consideration. And then you'd maintain the documentation used to make these decisions in your environmental review record. If your project doesn't meet any of the exemptions, you need to determine if there is important farmland on the site. Important farmland can be cropland, pasture land, or forest land that's considered prime, unique, or farmland of statewide or local importance. Prime farmland is land that has the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing a variety of crops. Unique farmland won't be listed as prime farmland, but it has characteristics that produce high quality and high yields of specialty crops like nuts, fruits, and vegetables. Farmland of statewide or local importance is just that. Farmland that's been determined by the state or local government to be important based on local conditions. The state or local jurisdiction has provided the criteria for these designations. To determine if there's important farmland on your site, you can do one of two things. You can complete the first part of the farmland conversion form, and the title is AD-1006, or you can check the web soil survey online. Let's start with the web soil survey. Chris, I'm going to come to you again. Can you show how to use the web soil survey?
Sure. So we have a second tool here, and it's a very powerful tool, but it does require a little bit of navigation to find that information. So the first step to access the soil survey is to go to the URL on the screen, or you can search for Web Soil Survey, and it should be near the first on the links. You'll start out on the Area of Interest, or AOI tab at the top of the screen. This is where you're going to define the area you want to analyze. Under this tab, you'll select the address, and this will bring up an address box. Here you can type in the address for your location and then select the View button. In this case, for the address, I selected the city of Spokane, Washington. You can also enter your exact project location. Once you have a zoomed-in map, you still need to define the boundaries for your area of interest. You can draw these boundaries using either the rectangle tool or the freehand polygon drawing tool listed above the map. And here I've drawn a rectangle, just using my mouse, over the project area. If you need to redraw the project area, under the Area of Interest menu on the left, there will be an option to clear the AOI so you can start over. Once you've drawn your AOI, you'll get a soil map, and you can choose what information to analyze. So you'll see we're on a new tab, Soil Data Explorer, at the very top. And under Soil Data Explorer, there's a submenu, and it will default to Suitabilities and Limitations for Use tab. Under this tab, find where it says Land Classifications. Click there, and then under there you'll select Farmland Classification. And then finally you click View Rating. Once you've navigated all of those button options, you'll get a color-coded farmland classification map, as you can see here. For many project sites, you might only have one color, but here you can see the reds and blues and greens to show how the map actually color codes different types of land. A legend is available if you click Legend to the left to help explain what you're looking at, but you can also scroll down to the table below the map where it lists what the map unit is, whether it's prime farmland or other type of land, and also acreage, which you'll need this information if you are filling out the farmland conversion impact rating form. Back up at the top, you can print the map, legend, and table for your environmental review record by clicking on the printable version. In this case, that will create a report with the map, legend, and the table. And that's it for this tool. We've also prepared instructions for this tool as well. Debbie, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. If you're having NRCS make the determination of whether there's important farmland, this is the form that you'll be using. I spoke about it before, the AD-1006. The contacts for NRCS are at the end of the slide presentation. Let's look at the form. Part 1 is a basic contact information and is self-explanatory, except for the section on federal agency involved. Even though you are acting as a federal agency, you will need to identify HUD in this section. The purpose is to keep track of the amount of federal land that each agency converts or chooses not to convert. You will provide project information in Section 3. Once completed, provide it with a map of the location to your local NRCS office. They'll inform you within 45 days if there's important farmland in sight. It usually doesn't take that long, but they do have 45 days. If there is important farmland, they usually will provide the rest of the information they are responsible for when they return the form. So now you've looked at either the web soil survey or you have contacted NRCS. If you determine at this point that there is no important farmland on site, you can make a determination that the project doesn't convert agricultural land to non-agricultural land, and the Farmland Protection Policy Act isn't triggered. Maintain your backup information and backup documentation in your environmental review record. But let's say that you do determine that the project isn't exempt and there is important farmland on site. Now you're going to need to complete the farmland conversion rating form, the whole form. So if you haven't done it, if you previously completed sections 1 and 3, you will now need to complete sections 6 and 7. If you didn't previously complete sections 1 and 3, you'll need to complete them along with sections 6 and 7. I want you to be aware that if you're working on linear projects that cross over several tracts of lands, like utility lines, highways, railroads, stream improvements, flood control systems, your project is considered a corridor project. And there's a different form that you're going to need to complete for this type of project. The link to the form is in the resource section. I have heard of projects that were delayed when the incorrect form was used, so you need to make sure that you use the correct one. Okay. Let's go back to the Farmland Conversion Rating Form. Section 6 provides the rating factors that have been developed to determine which farmland site deserves the most protection from conversion from farmland to non-farm use. The higher the score, the more protection a site should receive. There are a total of 260 points. The factors that NRCS rates have a total of 100 points in Section 4 of the form. The federal agency, and that's you as a responsible entity, provide the determination on 160 of the points in Section 6. You will be looking at what is on the site, what's in the surrounding community. Will your project cut off other farmland? Is the farmland protected by state or local requirements? The instructions and guidelines for determining points are included in the directions to the form, so I'm not going to go through them question by question. Again, if you have questions as you're going through this, contact NRCS. If the project receives a score of 160 points or less, it's considered already in urban development. You can document your file. There is no further requirement under the Farmland Protection Policy Act. If the project receives a combined score of over 160 points, it should be considered for protection. You now need to reevaluate your project. Are there any alternatives to converting the important farmland? You have to evaluate at least one other site before you can make a determination to convert the farmland to non-agricultural use. As federal agency, you will make the final determination. If you determine that you will go forward with the project, you should identify if there are any ways you can mitigate the impact on the prime farmland. NRCS is available to help with the mitigation, or help you identify mitigation. Maintain documentation in your environmental review record showing the determination, alternatives considered, any mitigation required, and mitigation complete. You will need to return a copy of the form of the AD-1006 with your determination to NRCS after you have made the determination. Okay, that's basically it. That the compliance with the Farmland Protection Policy Act is completed once you have returned the form. Then the following slide shows a list of resources that we had talked about before. Are there any questions?
All right, it looks like the first question is, why can't we use zoning to decide if the act is triggered?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know that many of you in the past have used zoning. When the act was originally written and the regulations were written, zoning was listed as one of the methods for determining if it was an urban area. That was changed in 1994, and the different exemptions that I went through were outlined. So the preamble to the amended regulations specifically do say that you can't use zoning.
And our next question is, we are planning a community garden. Will we have to look at the Farmland Act?
Well, first off, if you're planning a community garden, the first question is, are you using federal funds? The Farmland Protection Policy Act only complies if you're using federal funds. If you are doing a community garden where you're not converting any agricultural land to non-agricultural use, it wouldn't come into play. However, if you were building any buildings, you would go through the process that I talked about before where you look at the exemptions. Are you in an urban area? Then you go through the other exemptions. Is this considered a farm building? And again, you might want to talk to NRCS to make a determination on that.
Our next question is, did you mean that we can save the map but add in our project as in draw it in? So I'll answer this question. I believe it's directed to the TigerWeb Census Bureau tool. In that case, you would have to somehow save the map, such as using a print screen. And then on that document, you could even just draw in where the project location is or use a computer program to edit that. It could be in a future version of the tool, you'll be able to print out a report. But at this point, you'll want to include that information in your map. And our next question is, are sewer lagoons exempt as are water reservoirs?
I'm not sure about that. That's one I would contact NRCS. My guess is it probably is not exempt. The water resource is more looking at reservoirs and projects like that. So again, contact NRCS and they will help you make a determination on that.
And our next question is, if urban land that becomes vacant is converted to urban farmland, will it be considered farmland under the Farmland Protection Policy Act, and who decides?
If urban farmland, so it sounds like you currently have an area that's not designated as an urban area. And the question is if it then comes out to be farmland. NRCS would be who you would contact again to make that determination. The maps are actually are older, so normally what we find with the maps is that there's an urban area that a town that has expanded out, and the maps will show an urban area over or a prime farmland in areas where there are houses built. And so the maps usually haven't caught up that way, but it is something that USDA defines.
And what about where land that's urban land already becomes farmland?
I'm not sure about that. We can find out about that.
Okay. The next question is, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, and we have leapfrog development and a variety of land uses. Have you encountered farmland in the heart of an urban setting?
I'm sure that there is farmland and prime farmland, important farmland in urban settings. And again, this is when you will have to deal with the potential for using the land density and where you have the 30 acres per 40, 30 structures per 40 acres. And there definitely is prime farmland and important farmland within urban areas.
Great. Well, thank you, Debbie. We have some other questions that we will try to get to at the end of the presentations. But now we're going to move on to the Endangered Species Act with Liz Zepeda.
All right, and now we'll turn to the final act of today's webinar, the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. The ESA is a really interesting act in that it's an especially powerful piece of environmental legislation. Unlike a lot of the environmental laws we cover at HUD, it's not procedural or a weighing of factors. The presence of an endangered species can actually stop a project. This makes it controversial, but it doesn't have to be intimidating. The overall structure is consultation-based and collaborative, and we hope that it can be relatively painless. This image is of a Kirtland's warbler, an endangered songbird. And the majority of the species shown in this presentation, including this one, are species that can be considered success stories of the ESA, those that have made great improvements since receiving protections under the Act. This is showing the good side of having such stringent protections. Showcasing the Kirtland's warbler on the first first slide because in addition to being a really beautiful bird, it's also one that I think a lot of us can imagine seeing in our backyards. Unless your backyard is a large area of dense young jack pine in Michigan, it probably isn't there, but I think we can imagine it. And I pulled this out to drive home that the ESA isn't all about polar bears and lions. These are animals you could actually come across in the course of a HUD project. The ESA has a lot of specialized terminology to be aware of, and I want to draw your attention to those right away. So to give a quick overview of how the ESA works, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NIMS, which are collectively called the services, are responsible for listing species as either endangered or threatened. Endangered species are those in danger of extinction, whereas threatened species are likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. For our purposes, the distinction between endangered and threatened isn't important. You just need to know that collectively, endangered and threatened species are called listed species, and they're protected by the ESA. When the services list a species, they also designate its critical habitat. Critical habitats are those areas found to be essential for the conservation of a species or to require special protections for that species. They may or may not be areas actually inhabited by the species at that time. Proposed species have been proposed to be listed in the Federal Register. They're not yet officially listed, but they're well on their way. Now, everything above, endangered and threatened, also known as listed species, critical habitat, and proposed species are all protected by the ESA, and you'll need to consider all of those during consultation. All of those should be distinguished from candidate species or species of concern. These are species that are being considered for proposal, but have not yet been officially proposed, and they're not protected under the Act. An oddity of the ESA is that it's carried out jointly by two agencies. The Fish and Wildlife Service in the Department of the Interior is responsible for listing and consultation regarding land and freshwater species, whereas NIMS in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, is responsible for listing and consultation regarding saltwater and anadromous species. So for the non-biologists, anadromous species are those that live in saltwater and breed in freshwater. So the one that comes up the most in HUD projects, and it does come up pretty often, is salmon. So to give you some idea of the numbers covered by all of this, there are 1,400 listed species in the United States. Incidentally, that's not rounding. It's exactly 1,400. And those are just those that are actually in the United States. So there are more listed species protected by the ESA if you count international species. And to give a breakdown, that's 605 animals, 795 plants. And of those 1,400, NIMS is responsible for 87, and the remaining 1,300 plus are regulated by the Fish and Wildlife Service. On this slide, I want to draw your attention to Section 9 of the ESA. Section 9 applies to public and private actors, and it's not limited to federal actions. This prohibits take, which is defined as to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or to attempt to engage in any of those behaviors. It's important to think broadly about the meaning of take. It's not just a prohibition against killing a listed animal, but a prohibition against creating a situation where a species is likely to be harmed. There's some very specific, narrow exceptions to this rule, and we'll go over those in a few minutes. Now here we're getting into the meat of the Endangered Species Act for federal projects, Section 7. Unlike Section 9, Section 7 applies only to federal actions. I include Section 7A1 here because it shows how powerful this act is. This is a statutory requirement to affirmatively act to conserve listed species. So think about how strong this language is. There's no need to worry about it when conducting your environmental review for an individual project. Section 7A2 is the consultation provision, and it's the focus as far as HUD environmental reviews go. Again, note how strong this language is here. You shall ensure. This is not just a consideration of effects. If the services determine that a project as designed is likely to jeopardize a listed species or destroy or adversely modify a designated critical habitat, it cannot proceed. You have to actually modify the project until negative effects are eliminated. This is a flowchart showing how responsible entities, or REs, may conduct Section 7 consultation. This is also available for download through the Files box on this page, and I'd encourage using it as a reference later on, but there's no need to absorb it now. The thing to take away here is the division of responsibilities between the action agency and the services. When undertaking Section 7 consultation, some decisions and documents are the responsibility of the action agency and others are the responsibility of the services. Under Part 58, the RE assumes authority to act as the action agency, and the services both have internal memoranda acknowledging this authority and creating special procedures for consulting with REs. These procedures are reflected in this flowchart. On this chart, REs are responsible for actions in blue, above the line, and the services take the lead on actions in red, below the line. Now I'd like to go through the steps of completing a Section 7 consultation. Step 1 is to determine if the activities involved in the project could have any effect on plants or animals. If a project has no potential to affect, it is in compliance with the ESA, and there's no need to engage in consultation. An example of a no-effect project would be an interior rehab project, something that just can't touch wildlife. If that is the case, you may proceed with your project without consultation. However, keep in mind that some species are very sensitive and can be disturbed by even light or sound, so if in doubt, continue to the next step. Step 2 is to determine if listed species and/or critical habitats are present in the project area. Traditionally, this is accomplished by writing a letter requesting a species list from the services. However, that information is now available online. And often, you can get great information on species in your area just from the service's website without any need to use the old-fashioned mail approach. But if you have any doubt, or if the information online isn't specific enough for you to know for sure, you can still contact the services to request site-specific information. You can also take advantage of other resources, like your local natural resources staff or colleges, to assist with this. And one other way of doing it is some offices get a blanket species list from the services covering their entire city or county that they can refer back to for each project. This can save time on individual projects and be a great reference, but remember to keep it up to date. Species move, get listed, and even delisted, so check back periodically with the services to get a new list. And again, this is the same as the last step. If there are no species in your area, the project is in compliance, and there's no need for consultation. Here's an example of a case where that second step, determining whether species were in the area, got a little complicated. In this case, the project site was a likely habitat for Kincaid's lupine, which you can see here, but it was impossible to determine whether there were actually plants on the site until their blooming season. A botanist was brought to the site and was able to identify soil that would not support the plant. The project was then redesigned to avoid any impact on those areas where the soil could support the lupine. After the project was designed to avoid those areas, HUD was able to make a finding of no effect. This shows the importance of early project planning. Because the project planners completed their ESA analysis early, while their plans were still flexible, they were able to avoid conflict with the listed species altogether. If you haven't already done so in steps 1 or 2, step 3 is to make a formal effects finding. There are 3 possible findings here. No effect, which means absolutely no effect, in which case there is no need for consultation. May affect, not likely to adversely affect, which is the appropriate finding if all potential effects will be beneficial, discountable, or insignificant, which requires informal consultation. And may affect, likely to adversely affect, which is appropriate if there are any effects that are potentially greater than beneficial, discountable, or insignificant. And this requires formal consultation. Make a separate finding for each listed species and critical habitat. It's possible for a project to have no effect on one species, a discountable effect on another, but a significant effect on a third, so you don't want to lump them all together. There's several different ways of arriving at a no effect finding. These first 2 are reminders. Steps 1 and 2 were both ways of finding no effect. The third is if there's no potential habitat on your project site. Here, you should consider both site and species. A backyard can be a habitat, but an urban infill or reconstruction project will almost always be safe. The fourth is by local programmatic agreement. HUD has PAs with the services in certain jurisdictions that outline specific situations when a no-effect finding can be made. These are in effect in Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and Florida. So if you're in one of those states, be sure that you have your PA on file and can refer to that. The final way is to make an informed decision based on the specifics of both your project and any species in the area, that the project will have absolutely no effect on listed species or critical habitat. Again, remember to consider the effects in the context of the listed species in your area. A project site that will have no effect on fish could have an adverse effect on birds, and vice versa. In all cases, the environmental review record should include supporting documentation, including photos, maps, and surveys as appropriate. And again, there's no need to consult with the services on a no-effect finding. The exception to that is if it's a particularly large or controversial project, you may seek a concurrence just for the record. I saw an example of this in a very large urban infill project. There was no potential habitat in the area, but the RE got a concurrence just to confirm that as part of their public record. However, you have no obligation to do that. If you can't make a no-effect finding, you need to move on to the next step and prepare a biological evaluation or assessment. These should be prepared if your project may affect listed species or critical habitat. An assessment and an evaluation are essentially the same thing. A biological assessment is just a higher level of formality and broader in scope. And in general, a biological evaluation is appropriate for HUD projects. Whether you prepare a biological evaluation or a biological assessment, your document needs basically two things: a thorough description of your project and an analysis of its potential effects. You want to make sure you give a full, complete picture, something with enough detail for the services to make an informed decision about their project's impacts. Now we're moving on to the fourth step, informal consultation. Informal consultation seeks to accomplish three goals: define the potential effects, explore ways to reduce, remove, or mitigate those effects, and determine whether formal consultation is required. As the name implies, this is done collaboratively and informally, and it's often possible to resolve all effects, modify the project as necessary, and conclude consultation without ever having to go to formal consultation at all. Informal consultation has two possible outcomes, and it's up to the services to determine which outcome occurs. So if you're following along in your flowchart, we're now below that line. The services may either concur with your finding that the project is not likely to adversely affect, in which case consultation is complete and you may proceed with your project, or they may find that the project is likely to adversely affect, in which case formal consultation is necessary. Formal consultation has one purpose: to ensure that the project is not likely to jeopardize listed species or destroy or adversely modify critical habitat. You may recognize this as the statutory language from Section 782. Your responsibility as the action agency is to keep consulting until you reach that goal, which will require modifying your project or developing mitigation measures to avoid jeopardy. Formal consultation concludes when the services issue a biological opinion with a finding that the project may proceed. The biological opinion is a document prepared by the services, which will state their findings, any required or recommended mitigations or modifications to the project, and, if necessary, an incidental take statement. Now remember back to Section 9, which prohibited all take. Section 10 of the ESA allows for an exception to that rule if, after formal consultation, the services issue an incidental take statement. If take occurs, even accidentally, without an incidental take statement, there can be major civil and criminal penalties. So it is extremely important to go through formal consultation if any take may occur. Here we have another case study to show how adverse effects can be eliminated through formal consultation. This project was new construction of 20 units of single-family housing on a previously undeveloped site. During ESA analysis, HUD discovered that the stormwater runoff from the increase in impervious surfaces on site would flow into a nearby river which contained listed salmon. And as a result, HUD had to make a finding that the project was likely to adversely affect the salmon, and they initiated formal consultation. After many weeks of formal consultation with NIMS, they jointly arrived at a resolution. First, the design was changed from single-family homes to two-story homes, which made a smaller footprint and less impervious surface area. Additionally, the project was modified to use semi-pervious pavers on walkways and driveways, and stormwater infiltration was installed at the project site. This is another example of the importance of early project planning and completing ESA analysis while plans are still flexible. And one other note on this case study is that the project sponsor was frustrated because the market rate housing across the street did not have the same level of stormwater mitigation. And that's true because Section 7 applies only to projects with a federal nexus. The housing across the street didn't receive federal money, and it did not have to consult, and therefore it did not have to mitigate to the same extent. Post-consultation, of course, it's very important to actually follow through and make sure that your modifications and mitigation measures that were agreed to during consultation are actually carried out. Especially if there's any possibility of peak occurring, failure to follow through could be a major problem. You should also remember to reinitiate consultation if necessary. Either you as the action agency or the services may request reinitiation if several different situations occur. The first is if the amount of take allowed by the incidental take statement is exceeded. Also, if new information reveals new potential effects, or if the project plans are modified such that the biological opinion no longer addresses its impacts. And finally, if new listed species or critical habitats are designated that may be affected. In conclusion, I want to remind you that matters related to species are extremely local. Both the types of species you're dealing with and the style of services offices will vary quite a bit from region to region and state to state. My advice is to get a good relationship with your local service office or offices. Get to know them and their procedures and how they like to operate. And don't be scared of ESA compliance. Be informed, use all the resources available to you, and get in there. On that note, here's some resources to help out with that. First, we have the services' respective ESA websites, but be sure to consult their local and regional websites in your area as well. The next is the Section 7 Consultation Handbook, which the services issued jointly and goes through all of this that I've just said in much greater detail. And finally, we have the Information Planning and Conservation System, or IPAC, which is a great tool that the Fish and Wildlife Service is working on. It's currently only available in some areas, but it's really useful to map out endangered species and critical habitats where it is available. So I recommend giving it a try and seeing if it's operational in your region. And that's it for this section. Now I'd be happy to take your questions. Thanks.
So the first question is, could you explain the meaning of beneficial, discountable, and insignificant effects?
Yes, it's important to learn what I actually mean by that. Beneficial effects are contemporaneous positive impacts without adverse effects. That one's pretty obvious. Discountable effects are extremely unlikely to occur. Insignificant effects deals with the size of the impact. It's where the size could never reach the scale where a take could occur, so extremely small impacts. So overall, for a finding of not likely to adversely affect to be appropriate, any effects should be very small, very unlikely, or purely helpful to the species.
And our next question is, when is a biological assessment, as opposed to a biological evaluation, required?
It's a good question and an issue where you'll hear different things. By ESA regulations, a biological assessment is required for major construction activities. That is defined by regulation as construction projects with a significant effect on the human environment, or in other words, construction projects that would require an environmental impact statement. So if a project requires an EIS, it would also require a biological assessment. A biological evaluation is a more generic term. So even if a biological assessment isn't required for your project, you'll have to provide the services with sufficient information to make a conclusion, and that's usually just called a biological evaluation. Whether you prepare an assessment or an evaluation, the content is basically the same. And this is an area that the preferences may vary from Fish and Wildlife to NIMP or from office to office. So you might want to talk to them and see what your local offices think. And Debbie and Sarah, feel free to jump in at any time if you have any different thoughts.
Okay, next question is, how do we know when to call in an expert to help make our finding?
Another place where it's a little difficult to pinpoint the moment, and I certainly appreciate any thoughts from Debbie and Sarah if you have any experience with this. In some cases, as in the Kincaid's lupine, it really is necessary to get a survey, and you'll need to call in a professional for that. But a lot of the time, you can figure it out yourself. You don't need a PhD in biology to determine that a rehab project without expansion isn't going to affect listed species. But if you're doing new construction on an undeveloped site where listed species might be, you may need to pull in a specialist. Just don't forget about the experts that are already available to you. Your locality may have natural resources staff that can assist, and your FEO at HUD can help you as well.
Okay, our next question is, how do you know whether a project is likely to jeopardize a species?
The long answer on that is that jeopardizing the continued existence of a species is defined as activities that would reasonably be expected, directly or indirectly, to reduce appreciably the likelihood of survival and recovery of a listed species. The short answer is that the services will tell you. That's a below-the-line activity on the flow chart. So it is the services decision. Your job there is to determine whether a species is likely to adversely affect, which is a broader decision.
And the next question is, can the PNDI be used? And that stands for the Pennsylvania Natural Diversity Inventory.
I'm not familiar with the Pennsylvania rules, but you'll need to refer to federally listed species. States will often have their own list of endangered and threatened species, but when it comes to a HUD project, it's a federal nexus, and you'll need to deal with the federal list. You can use state lists for reference. They might have some helpful tools for you, but you'll need to deal with the federal list.
And the next question is, what is a local programmatic agreement or tribal programmatic agreement?
I don't know that a tribal programmatic agreement would come up. Oh, I guess a tribe could make one. But a programmatic agreement in this context would be an agreement that HUD and the services make ahead of time. So this would be a broad agreement that would say, for example, all interior rehab projects will have no effect, and then you can just refer to that list of projects that would have no effect. And if your project is covered by the programmatic agreement, then you can make a decision just based on that. So it would be something that would apply to an entire state or a locality at large. So currently HUD just has them in these 4, I think I said, jurisdictions, and maybe we'll work on advancing that and spreading it a little further in the future.
This is Debbie. Also, a responsible entity, as the federal agency, could make an agreement with the services for specific types of projects in your area. So you could develop a programmatic with the services for the specific projects that you deal with.
Thanks, Debbie.
And our next question is the online Fish and Wildlife Services Section 7 Technical Assistance Step-by-Step Determination, and the questioner has a link, enough for an environmental review record since it does reference HUD projects specifically?
I'm not familiar with that, actually. So I'll take a look after the webinar and see. I would guess that that would be sufficient, but I'd just like to take a look.
Our next question is there a website that has species and or critical habitat listed by state or county?
Yes, the Fish and Wildlife Services website is easily searchable by county or state. And NIMS, I believe, is as well, although that was a little more obvious since it's marine. But their national website, which I've linked to on this page, makes that pretty easy to search. And I imagine their local ones do as well.
And another question, in Texas, we have the TPWD Texas Natural Diversity Database that lists state and federal species. Is this an appropriate resource?
As long as it includes federally listed species and is updated, which I assume they do, I would say that should be sufficient.
And we're going to start answering some of the questions from the earlier topics as well. So we have a question on wild and scenic rivers. And that question is, to what extent do we pay attention to the watershed and the potential impact of projects up gradient from a wild and scenic river?
That's a good question. The Act itself is quite narrow. The Section 7 that applies to federal projects is quite narrow. So again, you're looking at water resources projects in the bed or the bank. However, there may be some intersection with Section 10 of the Act as far as the administering agency. They may have some management restrictions that you need to follow. But in general, you're looking only at direct effects in the riverbed or bank.
And I think this will probably be our last question, also back to wild and scenic rivers. And this question is, the National Park Service website for wild and scenic rivers has examples of types of developments which appear most likely to cause serious adverse effects if they are constructed adjacent to or in close proximity to an inventory river. Housing developments are included. Will you please comment?
Yes, the Nationwide Rivers Inventory has less protection, but it's a little bit broader at what they're looking at. When you speak directly with the contacts, they are still following the Water Resources Project definition. However, the language in there is a little bit broader, and so this is, I think, a little bit of a gray area, and we can maybe write something up more specifically in the Q&As that follow this.
Thank you, everyone, for answering those questions, and you can always reach out to your local field and regional environmental officers if you have other questions, or contact the presenters if you have specific questions still from this webinar. And with that, we'll conclude our question and answers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris, and to Sarah, Debbie, and Liz as well. And thanks everyone for taking the time to attend today's webinar presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, the slides and recording of this presentation will be available on the HUD CPD Environment website, and the links are provided in the Q&A box on your screen, and you can check the training page for updates also. We will send you an email notification once all of these materials are posted and available. Please do complete the survey that you'll be getting so we can get your thoughts for future webinars. And also, please join us next Wednesday, September 12th, for the next webinar in this series, Historic Preservation in HUD. The registration link for that is also in the Q&A box on your screen. Once again, on behalf of the Office of Community Planning and Development, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.